We're going to show you how we fill the pans, or how I suggest to fill the pans. It's not too difficult, but there are a few tricks of the trade that will help improve your demonstration. The thing that you'll notice about soils, that they'll all react pretty much the same depending on what the consistency is. But when you put them in a pan like this, you have to also be cognizant of the different surfaces. And so my main interest with this is making sure that I don't have a lot of water piping around the sides of the pan and down into the infiltration that shouldn't be there. If you get into a pan that you know that you're going to have a lot of runoff out of it, then you want to set that up so that the water doesn't run down to the sides. You also want to set that pan up so that the water doesn't run over the outside edges of the pan, because your goal is to get as much water in either the runoff jar or in the infiltration jar. And so the way you set your pans up can really make a big difference in how well that works. This soil is a little bit wet, and I used to think that I needed to have perfectly dry soil. I think for your most impact, a good dry soil, especially in a conventional setup, is going to give you the very best presentation you can have. But don't be afraid if you get out on site and you're doing a spontaneous demonstration, or you get caught and you don't have soils on hand, you can still have a really good demonstration even though some of the soils are wet. I don't want to put a lot of clods in it. And my goal, especially for a conventional tilled system, is to put a demonstration together that will replicate what's happening at planting time. If you understand, most farming systems, when in a conventional system, are going to have that field as clean as they can. The soil is going to be fairly dry, fairly crumbly. It's not going to have lots of clods on it. It'll be a nice smooth texture, as you can see over on that one on that end. And so I want to try to replicate that as much as possible, because I want them to understand that I'm showing them what's happening in their field from the first raindrop that happens on that, and having it set up so like you just planted in that field, and now this is what happens after it starts to rain. You have in the trailer, there are 3 22-gallon trash cans, and I'd recommend that you find soils that give you the kind of performance and the kind of demonstration to suit your talk and your presentation, and that way those soils will react the same way every time you do a demonstration. If you're doing on-site stuff, don't be afraid to dig it right out of the fields and show them what's happening out there. It makes a pretty big impact when a person can see, this is my field, I watched him do this, and now I see what's happening out there. One of the first things I want to do with that little wildlife in there is, as I start to fill this up, my concern is the water piping around the outside edge of the pan and running under the soil and out through the infiltration. So as I'm going along and filling this up, I'm going to be packing the edge of this. And if you have a moist soil like this one, it packs fairly tight. Because my goal is not to have water run around the outside edge of it. If you're running a real dry soil like this one is over here, you may want to take like a water bottle or a spray bottle or something like that to wet those edges so that it packs fairly tightly along that edge. And I'll do that pretty much at least the halfway mark of the pan, and possibly all the way to the top. Just kind of depends on the conditions. This one will seal up pretty tight. These pans are designed so that you can put that funnel on the front or on either end of it, and it basically brings it up to the outside edge of the tray here. What I like to do personally is I want to use the outside edges on the sides as the highest points on my tray, and I want anything that falls in that to maybe move to the center of the tray rather than having it overfilled so that the water flows over the outside edge. Because keep in mind, your goal is to get as much water into those jars as possible. And I want my surface to look as natural as possible. Sometimes I'll drop a quarter or a big clod or something on that so that you have a point of interest for them to explain what's happening with this particular thing. If you put a quarter out there or something like that, that'll give you a pedestaling effect as you run the water off on this. You'll also find that in a tillage situation or the soils with the loose pan, you'll get some shrinkage on that as that soil starts to crust over and separate and fall apart. And so you may want to add just a little bit more on those just to counteract that, but always keep the edges a little bit higher than the inside so that the water will move to the inside of the soil. And even if you are a little bit short on your pan, keep in mind this is only about a 2-foot length of a pan, but you can show all the erosion functions or all the different types of erosion within this pan. You've got your raindrop splash, you'll show sheet erosion, you'll show sedimentation. You can actually show, if you run it long enough, you'll start to see how it's starting to concentrate and show some flow paths in it. But even if you are a little bit short on water, remember you have a slope here, but you'll see how the sedimentation will fill up at the front of the pan so that eventually the water will actually start to run off on that. It's not as desirable as having the pan set up right so that the water runs on through, but it gives you a teaching moment with that. Main thing I don't like to do is that when I'm training people, they want to pat it and pack your soil. And that's really not necessary because that's not what you're going to see in the field. And one of the most important points is watching how that surface breaks down and starts to crust up. In fact, it's not a bad practice if you want to start your simulator, run it for a little bit, and stop it and describe what's happening with that crusting effect. And then sometimes, or usually when you do that, that consolidation or that surface crusting, the next time you turn that on, your runoff comes a lot faster because then those soil particles have settled into the pore spaces, and instead of floating out, they'll settle down into the pore spaces and actually seal the surface better than if you just start it and run it and wait for that to happen. So don't be afraid to start and stop and try some different things, because your main thing is to getting your demonstration so that you can prove or show the point that you're really trying to show. The trailer's got what we call a template, and what it's designed to do is to cut you a sample out of a field or a pasture, depending on what you want to show. And it's a pretty good sturdy piece of equipment, but it's not designed to take a sledgehammer and drive it into the ground. And I hope you won't try to do that. First off is you won't get a very good sample with that. A lot of times those will break and crack. The timing for your sampling is, if you can get them when there's a little bit of moisture in the ground, they're a whole lot easier to take. If not, you may want to take a bucket of water out and try to soak it up around there just a little bit to make it a little bit easier to cut out. We supply you with the cutter and a little trim saw here, but if you can utilize one of these reciprocating saws, it makes the task go a lot easier. They're handy to cut the sample out. They also work really well to trim the sample down. But we'll do it the old-fashioned way this time. The first thing I'm going to do is go around the outside of the template, and I'm going to trim this or cut this so that I can get that thing to seat down. I'm cutting this 2 to 2.5 inches, maybe 3 inches deep, just so that I can get that to fit down in there. I've got that cut around, and that's basically to give me the shape of my sample. But then I want to make sure that I've got everything cleaned out around the edge and that that sample seats nice and cleanly over the whole rectangle. So I'm going to take out a little bit around the outside edge of it so I can see what I'm doing with that. Okay, now I can see my template and the edges of my sample. And when you're pulling these samples out, you want to be really careful and not be real forceful on the template and stuff. You don't want to break your sample because if you get a big crack in that, then the water's just going to pour through that, and it's really hard to repair after you've overdone. You've messed up that original sample. So I'm just going to take my knife and I'm going to cut down along scrape this down along the edge, because any little bit of grass or roots or rocks or things like that, you need to clean that out so that you can get this to seep down. A pretty good way to tell if you've got your sample seated in your template is to push down on the push plate, and if it feels pretty good and solid around it, then you probably have it set. If you have a real sloppy edge or something, go ahead and keep cleaning that out until you've got that seated good and tight over the sample. That's not too bad. If I was using the Sawzall, what I would have done with that is I could have gone down along this edge, along all four edges, cut my trench out, and then pried it out. It's quite a bit faster, takes a lot of the work out of it. But if you don't have it, then that's what. And if you don't have the templates, you can do the same thing with the regular soil pan. You just have to be careful not to bend them all up. So our next thing is we're going to cut a cone of soil out of this so that we don't put any pressure on our sample when we're digging it out. I'm going to dig down beside the sample, break it loose, maybe. And I may be overly cautious on getting this out, but the last thing I want to do is have to do this again. And I'm prying this a little bit to try to break that loose. And the main thing I don't want to do is I want plenty of soil to pry on underneath it. I'm going to use this bucket because I'm going to roll this over and I lift it in and set it up on the bucket so that I can work with it without pushing that handle down through it. Now then we'll use a serrated edge so it'll cut the roots and not tear your soil and not, but you just go down and take chunks of that off. I'm going to take the biggest part of it off first and then we'll trim it down shallow. Okay, before I start trimming it down to the level of the template, I'm going to make sure that I've got that seated in there really good and trim it down. Okay, now's the time to fix your sample. If you've got any breaks in it, or if you've got any holes, or if you've had a rock or a root or something that's pulled or that's created a hole in it, you can fix it from the bottom, and I normally will just pack those in there, not real tight. I don't want to mess up the infiltration on it. But if you cut your sample so it's level with the edges of it, we've set that up so that when you put this in your pan, that it'll bring it right up to the front and the back edges of the sample. If you have too much soil on the top of that, then you'll overfill your sample, and sometimes your samples will be too full and the water will actually run over the edges of the pan. And so now we're just going to flip the pan up, and we'll set it right back down on top of the bucket. And then that's what this plunger is for, is to push the sample out. Okay, so now you're just going to pull the template out of there fairly easily. And the next thing you'll need to do is, you'll notice there's a little bit of a gap along the edge of that for where that template set in. Now the bottom of it wedges into the bottom of the pan because the pans are tapered, but you'll still want to go along the outside edge and pack the sample so that your water doesn't just run out the outside edges. The last thing I want to do with this is, after I've got it cut out and prepared, is I want to cover those edges with the cover that came from my sample, or my sample area, because it doesn't give you the right image if you have this soil around the outside edge and that soil starts running off of your tray. And so you want to cover that up as much and protect that as much as you possibly can, with just a little extra vegetation if you need to, and so that doesn't get into your soil jars. So take a little care and get them set up just right, because sometimes you only have one chance to really make a good impression on people. And doing these properly and getting them set up so that it shows what you're trying to teach them, it will pay off in big dividends. So this tray's ready to go, and we'll take it back over to the simulator.